Today's May 18th, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me Justin Hart, who's the author of Gone Viral, How COVID Drove the World Insane, if I'm not mistaken. Justin, tell us about your motivations for that book.
Dr. Bach, great to be with you. I'm in San Diego. I've got 8 kids, kind of a Brady Bunch scenario. I've got 4 at home. I got 4 out of the nest. And we experienced quite the wreck when COVID happened. When COVID began, January 2020, by trade, I'm a consultant. And my key client there was providing golf excursions for baby boomers. So you can imagine how that fared by the spring. A lot of my clients were that way. And so I had some time on my hands and I decided to do one of my favorite things, which was to delve into the numbers. I'm kind of a data guy by trade. I build kick butt charts and dashboards for my clients. And I do really detailed sales, marketing, infographics. And also I kind of stayed my hand into a little bit of healthcare and virology. 2 years previous to the pandemic, I found myself in a hospital for a week and a half, uplaid with a staph infection. And it was just something that got in through a little cut. And it's that natural flora that you have on your skin. But this tiny little thing just wrecked my body. And I wanted to know why. So I kind of delved into the numbers. I realized when I went to the hospital for sepsis, I had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. I got to know all the stats pretty intimately. And so I felt like I was, at least from a layman's perspective, pretty versed to handle a couple of these things. And so when Dr. Fauci and crew got in front of Congress and said, we think that 1 out of 100 people will die from this thing, I said, wait. That doesn't sound right. I know how funnels work. In fact, a lot of people know how funnels work, right? Like you have so many people come to your website and then so many people then leave their email and then so many of those become opportunities for sales and then so many of those become customers, right? The funnel. And when you think of those terms, it's pretty simple. The CDC clocks this. They call them the burdens that you have in influenza. So in the very high 2017-18 season, you had 44 million people who got sick. You had about 22 million people who visited the doctor. 800,000 were hospitalized, and something like between 50 and 90,000 died of influenza that year. Okay, so if you take that 44 million and you take that 50, 60,000 that died, that turns out to be about 0.14% of all people who contract it would die. And what Dr. Fauci was doing is he was coming in at this level, right? And saying, well, let's do the math here. And I said, that is the wrong place to do a funnel. You're going to screw up your statistics if you do that. And that started the whole ball rolling. So I built a group called Rational Ground. We became a ragtag bunch of experts, analysts, moms and dads, activists, people who basically were like, I don't think this is the right approach. And it grew and grew. By the summer, we had become the de facto group behind Scott Atlas when he was at the White House trying to right the ship with the Trump administration there and fix what had been broken. And so on a daily basis, we would get the call. We called it Project Alpha, just for a code name. And whenever Alpha would come in with a request, we would go to it. This was completely pro bono. And we had a horde of 15, 20 people all over the place. We need stats in St. Louis. We need stats in Arizona. And meanwhile, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx had this entire army of people down to the county level that were trying to produce all this data for them. So that was the genesis. From there on out, we thought, is this fight still going on? And so we fought tooth and nail. We tried to provide data for local county administrators. We met on Capitol Hill just recently. And so that's the story of Rational Ground, which is a bunch of people who probably don't have a degree in healthcare, but knew that in many terms, we usually don't insert ourselves into other people's domains. But Dr. Bach, they had no problem inserting themselves into our domains, into my kids' education, my business, my school, my church, my barbershop. And so I hope they'll forgive me if I inserted myself into their domains to understand and check their math, because it turns out the math was wrong.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Well, thank you for your work, first of all. Sometimes it's a thankless task, and for people, everyone has a thankless task. I try to go out of my way and thank them 3 or 4 times in a row. So, Rational Ground is a very interesting term there. Rationality, that has the root word ratio, and some of the basic ratios were missing. I think, there's I can't remember the law. Never ascribe to malice that which can be explained by stupidity. And then my friend has a corollary to that. Never ascribe to stupidity what can be attributed to laziness. So he has his own offshoot of that. But I'm trying to go backwards in this, and I think there is potentially malice, a forethought, to ignore the proper ratios. My recent work I have in Brownstone. I have two pieces. One is on Zika, which is my main thing. We'll get to that maybe later, or not at all. But I recently wrote a piece on Donald McNeil, the erstwhile chief science global health expert at the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote an article, I believe in February 2020, the coronavirus, go medieval on it. And this was a rallying cry. This would be before there was a single case in New York City at all. But it was after the existence and knowledge of the data of the Diamond Princess, where there were ratios of people. 3,711 people were stuck on this boat, and it wasn't the love boat. It was the Corona boat, and it was off the coast of Yokohama, and it was almost literally quarantined. I mean, the word quarente, in Italian, is for 40 days. So I'm not sure if they did the biblical 40 days out in the desert of the ocean. But they spent a couple of weeks there, and everybody who was released for the boat went through an additional quarantine of 14 days. And the data there were, they're pretty solid. I said this trope, hundreds of times on my show, which is that if you wanted to, post facto, organize an experiment, get 3,711 people on a boat for this unknown coronavirus, where the image is kind of like Pallywood, if you know what that is. People dying on the streets of Wuhan, and people in hazmat streets, and like as if they were radioactively, fallen out and fallen down. Anyway, so if you saw that kind of fear, whatever, shipped from China, I think there were two things shipped from China. One was the virus, and one was this, kind of like bogus, set of narratives. So you had your choice. You could pick China's, like Monty Hall problem. You have door number one, China's unverifiable, unfalsifiable, nobody on the ground, nobody you trust data, as it were, of scenes of horror, or the Diamond Princess, a boat, I forgot who owns it, but an American-ish boat, Diamond Princess, an English name, a bunch of people who had no whatever. If you wanted to get people on that boat based on what they showed in China, you would have to spend tens of billions of dollars, or you wouldn't be able to do it. Yet we had this perfect experiment in existence by January. And so, all the ratios were there. Ultimately, after 4 months, 10 people died on that boat. And the median age was 82. And that 10, let's see if we can do the math. 10 divided by 3,711 is 0. Let's see. 1/300th would be 0.3. It's 0.003%.
Yeah.
Or thereabouts. And the children had zero symptoms at all. They didn't even know they had it. The ones who tested positive after the fact. Anyway, sorry for that little discourse and diatribe, but I think it's important to know and realize that your rationality was rational, your claims and so forth, and what was really irrational was the way that there was this incredible, chicken without a head stuff going on.
Yeah, it's a difficult prospect, and I might give them some leeway if they got anything right. I mean, when I go down, one of the panoplies I usually trot out here is just going down the list of all the things they got wrong, from the origin of the virus, the transmission of the virus, the asymptomatic spread, the decision to take on PCR testing as the main facility, the fatality rate, as we just discussed, lockdowns, community triggers, business closures, school closures, quarantining the healthy, their statement that it would have very little impact on youth, that the hospitals would be overloaded, that plexiglass was a solution we should encounter, right? That social distancing was well tested. Outdoor spread was a thing, they said. Masks, of course, would help with everything. Variants, left and right, that everyone should be scared of. Natural immunity they dismissed out of hand. The vaccine efficacy that they touted to high heaven, and vaccine injuries that they continue to ignore. I mean, that's that's almost the short list of everything they got wrong. It's hard for me to understand what they got right. And that's so challenging to say, here are the people that we gave the keys of the kingdom to, right? They had full roughshod reign over this entire thing from Trump through Biden and everything else there. And they failed. They failed miserably. It's hard to understand exactly what they got right.
No, absolutely. And they're going to be, items appended to that as well. I think the one that's maybe you said it, but it's maybe not there, but one can is puzzled over the counterfactual aspect. Like what would our lives have been like if they hadn't gone all Chicken Little on this? And what are the damages in the wake of their having done so? You have a great line in your book. Basically, it's kind of, I can't remember who said this, but it's a line like, if the United States sneezes, everybody else falls over. I can't remember. I sorry for that. Anyway, basically, the first world, gets all paranoid, and the third world suffers. The third world depends on the commerce, and their lives are much more subsistence. Throughout southern, sub-Saharan Africa, there were basically zero problems across the board, except for South Africa, the country itself, which skews older population. But the younger populations of the world, developing nations, as it were, had like basically zero COVID problem, but they do have and still have commerce problems. They also have diversion problems, wherein the WHO has been, quasi weaponized to, be a coronavirus vaccine producer, and yet the ignoring HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, among others, and just the whole aspect of commerce. I mean, the biggest determinant of public health and our changes in public health has been prosperity. Prosperity is the best medicine ever invented, and I think there's been huge diminishments in the prospects thereof.
Yeah, I think one of the first set of people to raise the alarms for us were in the spring of 2020, when oncologists would come and say, "Hey, either COVID has cured cancer or something else has happened here," because they were diagnosing half as many cancers in their clinics as they previously would the year before. And in some cases, 80% drop in those diagnoses. And that was because people were too scared to go to the hospital. I'll never forget the text message I got from a friend of mine, Northern Orange County here in California. And he said, now both of my parents have passed away, neither of them from COVID. One died from an undiagnosed blood disorder, and the other one died from an undiagnosed cancer. They've both passed away now during these last 6 months. He said they were too scared to go to the hospital. And I remember that line, and Dr. Fauci, I remember when he recounted that to me over the phone, where he said, he sees Dr. Fauci in the hall, and he says, he challenges him. He says, "Don't you think they're frightened enough?" And Dr. Fauci said, "No, I don't think they're frightened nearly enough." That aspect of fear became like a prominent vector for all of our health overlords, as I call them, to use. Here in San Diego, Wilma Wooten, who is our health director here, she said, "You should just assume that everyone has COVID." And I'm like, you can't live your life that way. And now I see the impact on kids. I remember a friend of mine, I was over at his house, and his daughter, he's 6, 7 years old, had a Target catalog out. And this was like 2 years ago, but she was dutifully coloring masks on top of all the faces of the kid models.
Oh, so sad. Because
that was the way she kind of envisioned things. And now those impacts are pretty drastic. Another stat that cuts across all borders pretty much, and it's politically or otherwise. We think from 2 different studies that in the spring of 2020, we missed about 200,000 cases of potential domestic abuse and child abuse. Why? Because it's typically sharp-eyed teachers and administrators who call those things out, and kids weren't in school. And even when schools would reopen, how many bruises on mom's face did we miss because masks were required to drop off, right? These are the flip side of the coin that no one considered, right, and no one really weighed the benefits and cost analysis on this thing.
No, it's a sadness. I I'm a medical doctor, and I'm only working part time. Massachusetts still has, well, I'm writing and so forth full time, but my clinical practice is occasional, and I had been full time prior to this. But during the pandemic, I was not working full time. But there was a mandate for masks that actually continues, and I think Massachusetts is one of the 5 states. I think California has a variant.
We just released ours recently. Yeah.
Yeah, but the whole, so I have a long catalog of seeing patients. I don't know, tens of thousands, or I'm not sure how many patients over the years, 30-year career in medicine. But it's really important to get a face-to-face reckoning of people. There are a lot of clues. There are a lot of sensibility about what people are worried about, or whether they're comfortable and happy. I don't know, maybe you can do a little bit from the crinkles of the eyes, but if people are wearing glasses, or it's a difficult proposition, and it's hard to establish that relationship of trust with somebody when you don't see their face.
Yeah, we had a nurse here in San Diego who recounted to us how they were, testing this elderly gentleman again and again, trying to figure out what was wrong with him. Then someone took off his mask and saw the droop of the face and realized he had a stroke. It's like, man, I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible. And now, because of those missed social cues, I talked to our very brave director of preschool for our kids when they went to preschool during the pandemic. And she did everything she could to keep the masks off those kids, even while state licensing was giving her infringement after infringement, the same type of infringement she would get if a kid was injured. Yeah. It was crazy. And she tells me now, in this school year, they have this terrible, rabid case of biting across all classes because kids are not able to process, the type of interactions that they wanted and they should have had over the last 2 years.
Yeah, no, we're basically born little savages, and it takes a fair amount of work to get people, if you look at other animals, you can, you have to train a dog, you have to take some time to, get them acclimated, and dogs are the most accommodating of species. Monkeys, people have tried to keep monkeys as pets, and apparently they're very determined, they're very selfish, and they're kind of rapacious and whatnot. We have a little bit of challenge, to get people acclimatized and socialized and so forth, to kind of sacrifice some of their, greed and whatever. And school, there's schooling the subjects and whatnot, but yes, you're right. There's a social aspect to it, and people are missing that. I think there's a secondary aspect. One of my friends has 2 young kids under, single digits, probably like now they're probably 8 and 5 or something. And the older one was suicidal during COVID because, they live in the best place on earth. They live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a nice place ostensibly. It's got MIT and Harvard and very educated people. You can't, it's got a subway system. It's got, clean streets. I mean, it's a reasonably nice place to live, leafy, all that kind of stuff. You're right next to blah, blah, blah. And his kid wants to kill himself. Why? Because it's not Cambridge. It's lockdown.
Yeah.
And
look, it's a terrible prospect. And I think one of the challenges is that, as adults, look, we got shafted. My business got shafted. Your business got shafted. Lots of people really got the short end of the stick on this thing. And hopefully we can take that sort of anger and go to the ballot box with it, or make some change by, our civil discourse to do something on that. But our kids don't have that luxury, right? And they're, who goes to get their years back there? It's a very difficult proposition. And I think one of the things that we find with kids is that we said they were so resilient, but the impact on them is so drastic. It's tough to see how they get back. Jimmy, just think about it, because our lives were shortened, by 3 years, but it was a lifetime for these kids. If your kid was a freshman in 2019 in the fall there, they missed the latter part of their freshman year. They probably didn't go to school their sophomore year. They had limited access to dances and events and sports their junior year, and by their senior year, it was all over. And that was just the short of it. But I think one of the things that we see again and again, there's an old there's an old fable that's passed down through rabbinic tradition. I think I mentioned it in the book, but it basically it talks about how during the time of Noah and the people that didn't make it on the ship, right? The waters came to their knees and they grabbed their kids and they put them to their waist. The waters came to their chest. They put their kids on their shoulders. But when the waters got to their neck, these people who were downright evil put their kids under their feet so they could survive. And that analogy, I think, is apt for our day. For some reason, we saw our kids as these terrible vectors of disease, and people put them through the ringer. And that's, in many ways, unforgivable.
No, I agree. It is. It's a utter sadness. We had my now late mother-in-law in our basement. We would have let her out if she wanted to come out for about a decade, and she was in her dotage, pleasant enough, but limited mobility. During COVID, she was kind of an avid MSNBC listener, so she was reasonably frightened. But we had people coming in on a regular basis, and she ultimately died from death, from old age, whatever, 91 years old, after like a few months ago. But we kept her alive. I was all into the focus protection concept, and we were careful around her. Mind you, we didn't always wear masks around her because my wife comes down, she's playing cards with her every night or giving her dinner. She's not sick. We kept we didn't have your pithy name of Rational Ground, but I like to think I'm reasonably rational on these things. And I had been a deep dive. We talked about it with her. She wanted to get every vaccine that came around, but she also didn't want her grandkids to stop mating or meeting and dating and mating and whatever, on her behalf, because her life expectancy at best was going to be whatever it turned out to be. Pretty much, it was going to be maybe a year or two at that point anyway. And it's an upside down thing. The paradigm, I guess, what we all heard is, some mother sees her kid go out in traffic, she races out and pushes the kid, out of the way of the car, and she might damage her own life. And so we are always willing to sacrifice ourselves for our children. In this case, we were sacrificing our children for ourselves.
Yeah, it's something we're going to look back on, I think, very embarrassedly. And what's interesting is they went through the same thing 100 years ago. When you go back and read some of the news articles during the 1918 pandemic, you realize that a lot of the panic came across there as well. Masks were, of course, a mandate there. In the Bay Area alone, some 3,000 people were arrested for infringing on that particular mandate, including the mayor of Oakland. And then, there were the different sort of advocates for this or that. But I'll never forget this one article I read from Des Moines Register, and it said that the American people are greatly disposed to do whatever it takes for the common good, but they greatly dislike learning later that it was all for naught. And I think that's the most disappointing thing is you look at California, which basically my kid's playground swing set was padlocked for 2 years, right? And then you look at Florida, which was relatively open across the board from May 2020, and they have exactly the same age-adjusted fatality rate. And it's right. We've lost our nerve. We've lost our minds on this stuff.
Well, it was irrational. And I do think that there are different levels of virus. There's the actual virions, the tiny little things that, if it's like putting a golf ball through a doorway as far as the pores on the mask and so forth. And then there's the other virus, the meta virus, which was, I think, which was political. I think that, this was weaponized for political means. How do I know this? The ultimate change that changed the landscape of the American electoral process was the mail-in ballot. We did have mail-in ballots. We had the absentee ballot for whatever duration. We had military ballots, which are ostensibly the same type of thing. So we have this ability for people not present at election day to get a ballot in. Not hard. But this force feeding of a mail-in ballot producing, the kind of the fruits upon which ballot harvesters collected, changed the landscape. And I think there had to be an emergency in order for that to happen.
That's a difficult proposition. And, my trade actually I'm back into it, which is politics. I do political fundraising and analysis and strategy and demographics in my day job. And I remember that fateful day, March 29th, 2020. I had been a very proud and strong President Trump supporter. I knew he was going to win. I predicted he was going to win in 2016. But on March 29th, when he extended that first lockdown, I tweeted out, I said, he's going to lose the election. I knew he would, because I knew that even beyond all the shenanigans, even if a small couple percentage of people aggrieved because of the issues in the older demographic, or just staying home because their fear, that he would lose the election, and he did. And I was really sad to predict that. But also beyond that, what we see again and again is that, like you said, that disease of the mind. You can go back 400 years to a real plague, the plague in Italy. In the book, I talk about the works of Alessandro Manzoni, who was a 19th century author who wrote this great book called The Betrothed. But he did it on actual research that was done in the 17th century Milan as the plague took hold there. And he said the disease of the mind far overtook the people more than the disease itself ever did. And he did. He talked about one crazy incident that he got from the journals there. A man. It was thought that there were foreign adversaries coming into the city of Milan, and that they were whitewashing the walls and covering and anointing, as they call it, the benches with plagued water to further spread the disease among their enemies. And so, at one point during the day in a church pew, an elderly man, got up and he brushed off the pew. Someone in the back of the church accused him of anointing the pew. A crowd ensued, hauled him out of the church, and the journal entry just ends, "I do not think he could have survived many moments longer." That was the kind of crazy, ridiculous rancor that we witnessed ourselves here over the last 3 years. And again, maybe you're right. Maybe it's all just part of the human experience.
Absolutely. No, the scenes were raucous. I mean, I was assaulted once on this topic. I belonged to a squash and tennis club, and I was sitting watching a game. Somebody's daughter was getting a lesson, and she's young, 11 or so, and she'd already had a vaccine, whatever. And I think it was around the time getting second ones. And I'm like, well, I'd be a little cautious. I mean, kids don't really get sick from this to begin with. I had your daughter she already had the COVID. We've never, we never gave vaccines after the fact, first of all. Vaccines are a pre-thing. If you have them, great. If you had one in 2019, awesome. Maybe early 2020. And for the people who had not gotten the illness, fine, you could have that at some later date. But vaccinating people who've already had the illness itself, this is not something that's medical. This had never been done. Vaccinating years after the fact, as has been going on and so forth. I know people who've had 5 shots. This is kind of a lunacy. Anyway, I was just chit-chatting very quietly, on the couch at an appropriate distance. So, and a guy who's more credentialed than I am came in and screamed at me, and he literally got in my face and all this kind of stuff. And he was waving his arms around. He wanted to take me outside. Anyway, it was just a craziness. I had to try to calm him down, because it's not a good look for me, to be yelled at. But this happened over and over again. There's all different kinds of ways that I became the virus in certain of the organizations I belong to. I don't know if I belong. And people went nuts. It's huge social fissures and fractures that happen repeatedly. I'll just give you one tiny example. On my quiet, leafy suburban street here, there are not many cars, and I was being respectful for all the people who were masked up and lunatic. I wasn't going to wear a mask outdoors. There's never been a single transmission case,
Right.
Noted or docketed of people getting outdoor transmission. Anyway, so I'm walking my dog, and I'm in the middle of the street, and I'm clearly like at like a 15 to 20 foot arm's breadth away from, lateral breadth away from this woman who's walking in parallel with me, but the opposite direction. So she's on the sidewalk. I'm in the middle of the street, and she's about my age, but she's got kind of the scared mouse looking at a lion kind of thing. and she's got the mask, and I can see she's kind of, shaking or whatever. And then she sees me walk by, and she kind of like sidles away, and she trips on like a half an inch or an inch of the grass. The grass is not parallel with the, so she winds up tripping and falling over right then and there. So I'm like, oh my God, she fell over. So I'm a doctor, trained to help. I go over to, check her out. And that was even worse. That was, you mentioned the Invasion of the Body Snatchers in your movie. It was like Invasion of the Body Snatchers moment. She had this horror in her. Like, no, go away. And, whoa, like, you okay?
Yeah,
I'm going to walk away, but, I want to make sure, you break a hip or whatever. And that was the worst thing. So, in this case, I think FDR said there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Yeah, pretty much.
Look, and these same things. So it took the climate change activists about 4 decades to convince the world that what we exhale was killing the planet. It took them all of 4 weeks to convince the rest of us that what we were exhaling was killing grandma. And so with that kind of power and fear, I think the main reason. So my group then went up to Capitol Hill just recently, where we did sort of storming the Capitol, but the right way. We had one-on-one meetings with congressional leaders and offices where we conveyed to them all the things that we've been talking about, and talked about, how we need these reforms. We want to see some federal action on this, that, or this. That. And what we would do, though, is, you come to realize very quickly that a lot of these same tactics, a lot of these same tools, these same strategies could be employed for whatever they choose, whether it's the next variant, the next virus, or climate change. The idea of everyone donning masks for climate change sounds ridiculous, but I wouldn't put it past them, right? And I think that's the real next step, which is understanding, okay, what went wrong? How do we make sure this never happens again? And it's unclear exactly how we do that. A couple reforms, like we would have basically the regulation hot potato that everyone witnessed, which was you'd go to the county and you would say, why are you quarantining my kid for 10 days for the slightest exposure of a positive case in his class? Yeah. And they would say, look, it's out of my hands. It's the state regulation. So you go to the state and the state says, look, the counties can do whatever they choose. You go down to the counties and the counties say, we're just following the CDC guidelines. Just following orders. That was right. Yeah. And that was the whole thing, is like those CDC regulations became law, and without any sort of vote, without any sort of discussion, without any cost benefit analysis, and something like that needs to change.
Well, there's I wrote a piece I couldn't get. I got published in the American Thinker, which doesn't have a huge circulation. It's a good journal, but early on, what bothered me is a thing called Bayes' theorem. So there was a Reverend Bayes, B-A-Y-E-S, and he was a minister and a mathematician, a little bit like Pascal. And are you familiar with Bayes' theorem?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
So basically, when you are hunting for something, if it's in an area in which that thing is very uncommon, when you think you found something, it's more likely you didn't than if you had been hunting for it in a place where it's more common. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a bomb detector or a device at an airport, to sniff out bombs, and you're working in Kabul in 2004, whatever. When your bomb detector goes off, you have to put far more respect into it because there are a lot more bombs around. So the likelihood of finding one is actually higher because there's a higher prevalence of that item around. If you're the bomb detector in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1950 or whatever, or trying to find a quiescent time, the thing goes off more times. We see the same thing with fire alarms and car alarms or whatever. The car alarm goes off, and almost always it's not a burglary. Fire alarm goes off, it's almost always not a fire. On the other hand, if you're in the middle of a war and fire alarm goes off, that is more likely to hint at a fire. So Bayes' theorem actually dictates that when you have these positive tests, they're much more likely to be false positive in the low incidence timings. So when this thing got going, there were more cases in, say, Queens, New York City and whatnot than there were in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or Omaha, whatever. And so when they started doing mass testing across the board, they found that positive tests, and so it's not necessarily an actual illness, A, and B, as we've seen from, people testing positive for Omicron, which is not genomically relative of SARS-CoV-2, it seems to test positive for coronaviruses in general, which are part of kind of the human experience forever and a half. Coronaviruses are around longer on Earth than probably humans, and they've been part of the human, diet of common colds for as long as we've known viruses. So there's a huge blur when people did have a positive test, whether it had any significance at all. And really, the calling things of cases was an absurdity. When people had a case of tuberculosis, historically, it's when they had some evidence of actually having active TB. And we blurred these lines, and everything got manipulated and recalibrated and redefined falsely, and not the way they had been done historically medically.
Yeah, it really is that cascade of awful decisions. A butterfly flaps its wings here and a hurricane happens on the other side of the earth. It's a terrible sort of cascade of terrible implementations which they put in place. The oversensitive PCR tests, the CT levels that were set too high, and all of these things that we've been discussing for the last thing. Now the question is, what do we do with that information now? I think it's as a word of caution, right? There are scenarios where there could be a very, very deadly virus that could warrant some serious ramifications. So for example, the median age of death in the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish influenza, was about 29 years old, which meant you had the equivalent of a lot of millennials and a lot of young kids dying. Now, I don't know what my reaction would be if there were friends of my kids that were dying left and right. It would probably induce a distinct panic in me. The challenge was, in this case, the years of life lost, which is another calculation of the impact, was far less drastic than almost any pandemic we've had before. It just was very breadth. It was just a huge breadth of hours there. So I think there's some lessons to be learned here. We have to figure out what's the right level of these sort of pieces. We have Governor DeSantis, who's coming up now, probably going to declare here in May for his candidacy for president. I'd be very supportive of that, because I think the Pandora's box was opened up top, and the only way to put it back in, because when they extended the 2-week lockdown, for 15 days to slow the spread, on March 29th, they extended for another 40 days. And the problem that you had there is that basically gave license to 50 state governors, 3,200 county officials, and 13,000 school districts to do whatever the hell they pleased, which basically created this terrible amount of chaos. And I remember here in San Diego, it was all basically on, where you were within a 10-mile radius. If I went further eastward to God's country in Poway, they wore masks maybe half of the time. Went up to Carlsbad, where they're their own dominion there. All the restaurants were open. But here where I was in Carmel Valley, it was mask to the hilt. It's crazy.
And then, the quote unquote news people, the journalists, they I don't know how they sleep at night or any other time. Maybe they're bats and they sleep during the day. I don't know. But, how they can sleep with themselves when they clearly, disparaged those who had an openness, and they never showed the data, correctly. Like at one point, North and South Dakota had a different approach to masking and whatnot. And these are, you could draw them on a map. They're both little rectangles. They got the same population, kind of German extraction, same population, I don't know, 700,000 each, whatever. They're almost identical states, even in name. And the one closed down and the other didn't, for schools and whatnot. And then we had identical approaches. How hard would it be to have just shown that Florida, did better than New York State, and one was open, one was closed? Which one got lauded? Andrew Cuomo would have been president, but for a few other peccadillos and whatnot, and he was on TV, over and over again. All my friends, my left of center friends were, fawning over him. This is a leader. This is a man. Here he is, ecce homo. Behold the man. And it's like, I'm just misusing that phrase. I apologize, but and it's like his death rate, fatality rate, was much higher than that in Florida. And Florida had an older population, and not only that, he was recycling, the great kind of green recycling. He was recycling people back into the nursing homes with coronavirus. This is the only time and place you should have been careful about COVID and coronavirus were for the elderly. And mind you, nursing home people, we love them. Like I love my mother-in-law, but if you're in a nursing home, the life expectancy without coronavirus in 2018, 2017 is about 13 months, median. And so people are not going to live there forever. Anyway, so it's not a good thing that Andrew Cuomo did, but he's talking about frail and elderly people, but it's like it would not have been that hard to show that states such as Florida were doing just hunky-dory, and Pennsylvania was doing no better, frankly worse. New York was doing worse. Who got promoted out of this? Rachel, like Richard, whatever his name, Richard Levine, I think, right now, aka Rachel, was the health director for Pennsylvania, and his own mother, he kept out of this.
Out of the Pennsylvania nursing home. Yeah,
and,
really, that it's those professionals. It's the professional class that has taken it on the chin. Now, you guys have had a rough go over the last 25 years, from the very first patient of yours that printed out a WebMD page and brought it to you, and you go, I have no idea what this is. And they tell you, this is what I have, right? I mean, that's been the lot of the information age hitting our healthcare system. And it only got worse during the pandemic. It's my kindest interpretation. But yeah, there's a huge gap now of trust that needs to be sort of rebuilt in this realm, because it seems like the ball was kind of dropped, and that if you were a borderline agoraphobe as a healthcare professional, you went full on quarantine, lock and weld the people inside their houses, right? Yeah,
no, it's a sadness. I'm not sure I have friends, but I have acquaintances. I know a bunch of doctors, and I play tennis with some of them, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, one guy, been a long-term friend of mine, he had COVID, early on, maybe in March or April, something like that. He was fine. He doesn't smoke. He's normal weight, and he was in his 50s, early 50s, whatever. He's totally fine. And I asked him about it because I hadn't had it, and so I see him on the street, and we're chatting, no mask, and his wife had it also. She's fine. And I said, "Oh, this is awesome." And he sees kids. So I said, "This would be a great opportunity. Are you still wearing the mask at work?" He's like, "Yes." I'm like, do you think you can get this again? He's like, "No." "Do you think you can give it to anybody else now that you're recovered?" "No." I said, "Well, wouldn't it be a nice message for kids to, show some light at the end of the tunnel?" He's like, I'm like, "Well, what's holding you up?" I said, "Well, it's not really the right time yet." I'm, "Well, who's going to say what the right time is?" And basically, to distill the answer, it's like politically, there's still a lot of leverage to get rid of Donald Trump. And he didn't want to, his congeners, whatever, they didn't want to lose this. I mean, literally, I'd have to come up with exact phrasing, get hypnotized. But basically, that's the message he gave me, that when, Nancy Pelosi doesn't think it's the right time to let the foot off the, I don't know, the gas pedal or the brake, whichever one it was, not the right time to do this yet, to undo the emergency. And we don't want people to think normalized, because you want there to be an emergency. Anyway, I just but dude, aren't you? I mean, to whom is your obligation? I think your obligation is to the patient. And here you have kids under distress and duress, and this is effing up their world and their mindset. How can you have the doctor-patient compact, while you're treating a national, political whatever. And we haven't spoken that much since, to be honest with you. This is how I lose friends. No,
everyone lost friends during the pandemic, and it was a very difficult time. I've got family members that won't speak to me, especially after my book, and I understand, right? But I think the idea is, in the end, I'll give you an example. Scott Adams, who's the author of Dilbert the cartoon, right? He and I had some very good exchanges, and he would retweet me, we'd DM, we'd talk about things on the COVID thing. And then one time I suggested on the issue of the vaccine that we will probably see the largest class action lawsuit the world has ever seen in the next 3 years over this thing. And he blocked me immediately on Twitter, right? And so people have their touch points. And I remember he says, he then came back around and said, okay, well, maybe the people who were against the COVID vaccine mandates were right. And then he asked aloud, he said, how did you know? And I answered him, I said, look, the way you know is you stick with the Constitution, and then you support your kids. And you do those two things first, you'll end up on the right side of history. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It was pretty basic stuff.
I don't think he has kids. I'm not sure.
No, I don't think so either. Look, this was hugely impactful. every single corner of society has been impacted.
Well,
The financial crisis we're going through, and we will be going through shortly here, it's going to be terrible. And you can point it and tether it right back to those first printings of dollars, which they doubled down in the
right,
Biden
I know.
administration.
Like,
So
what could possibly be wrong with this scene? Have everyone not work, and yet they're getting the same quote unquote salary, money, replacement fees. And where are you getting that? Well, we're taking trees and we're slicing them up. We print ink on them, and we're going to hand them out to everybody. That's new money. It's like, I was a chemistry and physics major, but one of the seminal, I don't know, interesting courses I took at Yale was kind of on economics. And for some reason, I got a guy who was not a leftist. I still don't understand how Yale let that happen. But basically, when you print a lot of money, that money was worth less, and it's not worth less completely, but it's has less worth, and that makes sense. I mean, if you, I don't know,
well, then on top of that, we're having this huge deflationary issue because of all the backup in the supply chains, right? In the book, I talk about the most interesting parts sometimes are the interviews I did with some business leaders. The reason why, for example, that we ran out of toilet paper is that massive rush on TP is that, forgive the expression, but we do half of our business at our business, right? And the idea is the type of the supply chain, the type of paper, the type of distribution comes in on these big pallets into big towers, which are then distributed through the staff. I mean, that's half of the business. And when you shut that down, all of a sudden they had to scramble and say, we got to build more of that soft, cushy bear stuff, right? And so that was like one example. Another one was a guy who is an engineer on the Vegas Strip, right? And for 2 months, they were shut down. Well, people don't understand that buildings are designed to have a certain amount of occupancy in them over a course of time, right? And so when you get rid of everyone, all of a sudden the entire sewer system backs up because it basically designed it for a certain amount of flushing. And so literally he and his staff would spend 3 weeks in April and May doing nothing but walking the halls of the hotel, going into each bedroom, tending to the loo, running the faucets, because otherwise Legionnaire's disease. And so these huge, terrible impacts on our economy. One more, here in California, you remember about maybe 2 years ago, year and a half ago, when it was ships as far as the eye could see off the port of Los Angeles, right? Because they couldn't. There was such a rush to get goods to America that they couldn't get them in on time. No. The reason was staffing. They tried to train more and more of these crane operators, but because of fears of COVID, they didn't have the people train in the same cabin next to each other, only on virtual machines.
Yeah, I remember.
So people failed the test.
I read that in your book. It's just like
it's just a terrible cascade of domino effects that no one anticipated. It's awful.
Yeah, and I just think there's a lot of we'll be paying for this in one form or another for a long time. The riots. Getting back to politics. The Sturgis rally was people, the talking heads on TV and so forth were horrified, and everyone's like, oh, you can't do this, so dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But the actual ripple effect in the areas of Minnesota and the upper Midwest, where the bikers were, they had no ramifications in terms of death rate or incidents, and so all that kind of stuff. And so that was decried. But the George Floyd related riots, Antifa, BLM, that was considered a public health moment that everyone should get out and vent their things more important. Part of your public health is to have good politics. And so that was everyone like milling around outdoors, whatever. It's like, dude, it's either a deadly virus or it's not. Like, get your act together. But it would always go obviously unidirectional. This is why there was a huge political component of this, and we're seeing it now. From the Durham report, and so that a lot of the government clearly, was they were not going to let 2016 happen again, and there was a lot of stuff in place where the bureaucracy of the government was not in line with the executive, and now it is. Thank the Lord. But the stuff that happened politically and allowances were made only unidirectionally. It's just a sadness for me.
Look, closing it out, I think there's some key things here. One of the things just to understand is that vindication for us is probably going to come down the road. It's a very difficult subject. I think for most parts, whether it's the closing of schools or masks or quarantines, most people have come around to our side, right? There's still some holdouts on the vaccines and everything else there. And we have to kind of figure out what that's about. But I think what we're going to have to look to is that Dr. Fauci is never going to be frog marched out of Congress. None of these people are really going to be held accountable. It's going to be up to us to implement actual policy and law so this never happens again. And we may have to be satisfied with that. I hope I hope my stomach can handle that. But it may be that we never convince the entirety of the American populace that this was the wrong decision until probably a few years down the road.
Fair enough. Are you in contact with Scott Atlas?
Yes, talked to Scott on a regular basis and had him on my radio show earlier last week. And he's got this great Global Liberty Institute, which I think is going to be really exciting. It's kind of meant to be a counter to the WEF, which is desperately needed.
His words, I think, were misconstrued. They let it rip and all this stuff. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, yeah. We were on talk with him about his Twitter stuff and everything else there, and he got in trouble for this or that. It was just a crazy moment. And Scott will admit himself he's not the most socially media adept there, but in the end, I know he got kind of the short end of the stick there too.
All right, so we're going to close out shortly. Do you have any overall message? What's your? I mean, I suppose you kind of put it out there. That's got to be, we have to be patient and political and proactive. But what's your message to people down the road, maybe listening to this year or two, 5 years, 10 years later?
I would say, in general, I never expected myself to be in this position, let alone to write a book on this thing. But in the end, I would say a good life lesson learned: stick your neck out in pursuit of the truth and what is right, and you'll be rewarded either then or certainly later on. But you can never go wrong, and you'll be on the right side of history by just sticking with the truth and doing what's right.
No, I like that. My grandmother had a more graphic version of that. We're going to use the word poop instead of the word she used. She said, "Don't let them poop on your face. Open your mouth." That's memorable, isn't it?
Okay, yeah, I'll remember that one for sure.
Yeah, no, it's a really good one, especially if you use the S word instead.
There you go.
So here's your book. People can get it on Amazon. Great cover. Just as my shameless self-promotion aspect, I have a book out as well. I don't know what is this thing here.
I read your article in interest. I'm going to dig a little deeper in that. That'd be great to talk about at some point.
Overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. This is the last previous great pandemic. People forget, but it was a big deal in 2015, 2016 in Brazil. This Zika is a real virus. Here's my picture in case people want to have this. Zika is an actual virus. It's a dengue. Just for argument's sake, there's 4 dengues, and then this little guy. There's a 5th dengue, which is called Zika, and dengue never caused microcephaly. Supposedly Zika does. And microcephaly is a real thing, but it just so happens that one doesn't cause the other. Anyway, it's very instructive. A lot of same characters. Dr. Fauci overstepped on that. There's going to be a Zika vaccine around the corner.
Oh, wow.
There's one coming out. It's 8 years. Mind you, the WHO had experts throughout Latin America telling people to have a birth moratorium. There was used as a stand-in to kind of.
I didn't think about that. I want to talk further about that because that's a big topic that I like to cover too. On
they tried to undo the abortion laws in Brazil as an emergency basis. I went to the Supreme Court there and all this kind of stuff. But the actual facts on the ground were never really substantiated, corroborated. There was a lot of conjecture, and it got out of control. I don't know if that sounds familiar.
It totally does.
But anyway, thank you so much, Justin.
Dr. Bach, great to be with you. Great to see you face to face, and hope to encounter you in person one day, okay?
All right, good. I'll let you know about when this is out. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else. Have a great